Hello, members. Good evening and welcome. Thank you all for joining again for another session of our sip size mini tutorials. I am absolutely delighted this evening to be covering, shall we call it the king of grapes? A lot of people do. So the king of grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon. Behind the scenes this evening as well, I should mention, we have Mahesh again, and we also have Gil from the tastings team. So welcome to you two both. Thank you very much for looking after me this evening on the tech side. And yes, welcome to all of you members. If you haven't joined one of our sip size sessions before, I'm Anna Spooner. I'm part of the tastings and events team at the Wine Society, and we're hoping to do a bit of a whistle stop, sort of 45 minutes of madness. Hopefully some time for some questions at the end, but this is really an introduction to the grape variety. We could wax lyrical about all three of these wine regions of the wines that I've chosen to tell a bit of story about Cabernet, but we will on another session, but just unfortunately we don't have the time tonight. So we are going to have time to tour around Cabernet, go through a few places around the world that it's grown, a bit of history, but it's going to be hopefully a very useful building block for taking away with you and enjoying more Cabernet Sauvignon in the future. So final bit from me, please do feel free to use the chat, especially if you are tasting the wines tonight. We'd love to hear what you're thinking about those wines, and use the chat to talk to fellow members. We have, now that we're on webinar format with these sessions, got a Q&A button. That Q&A button is great for actually asking proper questions. The reason I say that is sometimes they can get lost in the chat, whereas if you pop them in the Q&A, then Gil and Mahesh behind the scenes will most definitely be able to feed them through to me, and we'll try and get through as many as possible at the end. For any of you who've been to one of my sip sizes before, they tend to be a bit quick fire because I tend to chat a bit too much. So you can't stop me when I get on a topic I enjoy. So let's kick off with Cabernet Sauvignon, and let's talk a tiny bit about the origins. We'll talk about where it grows, and then we'll move on to what it tastes like. And you're welcome to be sipping along with any Cabernet you like. For anyone who wants to start on any of the wines that I recommended, I would suggest starting with the 100% pure Cabernet. The others are blends. We'll talk about that in a bit. But I've got the Blind Spot Yarra Valley. If that had already sold out when you joined up and you bought something else, I recommended the Y series by Yalumba, another 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. So please do... please do start sipping. Absolutely. I'm going to be sipping along on that as well. And then when we talk about flavors, and aromas, it's a really good idea to have something in your glass if you can. But don't worry, I know some of you are logging on from all around the world and might be having a cup of tea. So Cabernet Sauvignon. In the world of wine, it's actually a relatively late entry, should we say, into the world of wine. Evidence of Cabernet Sauvignon around the 17th century, so relatively new, and it is a love child, another love child grape, a love child of Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. Both varieties are found in the Loire Valley, but they're also found in southwest France, and in particular in Bordeaux, and that's really where we are finding the those early records of the grape variety in the 17th century. Why does it matter? That well, first of all, I should say, for a long time, people didn't know that it was the love child of those two grapes. And it makes a lot of sense. It was discovered in the late 90s, but there's a certain aroma that can come from Cabernet that it has in common with those grape varieties. And a lot of people, you hear it used a lot, thrown around, but it's green bell pepper. It's actually a methoxypyrazine, which is a compound of aroma. A lot of people tend to either love it or dislike it. It's more prevalent in Cabernet Franc, that sort of herbaceous note. But winemaking has evolved quite a bit, and you get less of that green bell pepper. Most people's tastes tend to find it a bit confusing when you've got fruit and what is the capsicum. I'm not sure if it's a vegetable or a fruit, a pepper. Some member will know and be able to tell me. But I actually find it makes Cabernet Sauvignon more interesting. But because it's not widely loved, a lot of viticulture and viniculture, viti and vini, so grape growing and then winemaking, they've tried to reduce or remove that smell. And one way you can do that is making your Cabernet more mature, more ripe, so you can pick your grapes a bit later. The younger fruit tends to have that, but its parents had it, and that's why I tell you. So where does it grow and why? Well, it ripens quite late, and so you need some warmth. You need warmer climates, so mild to warm climates. It also has really small berries, and therefore the ratio of skin to juicy middle bit is actually a lot more skin. And what that means is we have a lot of tannin, so that drying sensation. And we also have a lot of colour. And the colour, we mentioned this last week, we were talking about Syrah having a dark colour. It's not quite as dark as Syrah, not quite as inky, but neither grape variety are good for spilling on carpets. Cabernet is a terrible wine to spill. So it is still very, very dark in colour, and it is that ratio. The juice is actually also really high in acidity. So we've already started to see that we've got high tannins naturally, high acidity, and that's what gives Cabernet its really good structure. So it's important to grow it in the right places so that you can maintain those small berries with lovely, lovely thick skins and lots of them. Generally, it's quite disease resistant. Again, those thicker skins help to fight against incoming diseases. So it is also what I would call very much an export grape variety. It's grown, I believe, in every winemaking country in the world. It is probably the best known black grape on the planet. But one thing I would say is that it's not like Pinot, which we saw in the first session we did 5 weeks ago, whatever it was. Pinot, very reflective. Riesling, very reflective of where it's grown. Cabernet Sauvignon, not quite so much. There are certain things that Cabernet smells like, and classic Cabernet, and wherever you grow it, there is a relative sense of consistency that you're going to expect certain things with Cabernet. It's got sort of a lot going on. I'll go into that in just a moment, but you're less likely to get this sort of insane diversity between plots and things like that, as you do with Pinot and as you do with Riesling. So perhaps you could argue it's maybe a bit more consistent for a consumer or a wine drinker. They're more likely to know and understand what they're going to get. For that reason, I've picked a couple of blends this evening as well, because I think it's really interesting, as Cabernet plays an amazing blending partner to some wines. So yes, let's go on to what it smells and tastes like. And you'll have to just bear with me one moment. I am hoping, bear with me a second, sorry. I've not got a very happy laptop today, my second laptop, but it is on its way to, here we go. So if you do have a wine in your glass, please do use it now. It's exactly the right time to be using it. And I will just make this extra large. Again, I've created one of my little visual diagrams to talk us through. But essentially, top left part of the screen, you're seeing all of the stuff that comes from the fruit. Now, there are a few things you might expect, but let me just say, first of all, the one really, really key thing that we expect to see in Cabernet is black currants, loads and loads of black currants. And we spoke about Syrah having black fruit last week, and I said I was going to try and do a bit of compare and contrast. But black currants and cassis are very much a flavour to expect from Cabernet. So that would be the universal truth across all Cabernets. I've also included, like you can see, the green bell pepper, those methylpyrazines. You can also get graphite. So I've put pencil shavings, but that graphite-y smell, I actually am getting quite a lot of that in the blind spot. If anybody's tasting the blind spot, Yarra Valley, I'm getting a real graphite sense there. Other fruits, generally black fruits, but I haven't included any red fruits. But if you're getting red fruits, that's definitely not wrong. Cabernet can sometimes display some red fruits. Violets are back again, that lovely floral lifted note. And then how about when we oak it? So, actually, sorry, I should tell you. There are two sneaky ones here that don't always display. One is mint, and that can be really lovely. You tend to get a lot of US Cabernets have this lovely menthol thing going on. You can get it in Bordeaux Cabernets, but I tend to get it more in the ones from the USA. And then the little sneaky one next to it is eucalyptus. And eucalyptus, we will go on to talk, well, we can mention it now, why not? But Australian Cabernets tend to display eucalyptus. Now, the compound that shares the aromas with eucalyptus is prevalent. They can't prove, though, whether it's to do with the terroir or to do with are bits of eucalyptus being blown into vats. There's all sorts of arguments against it, but you cannot deny that some Australian Cabernet Sauvignons smell like eucalyptus. And a lot of people can say they're quite medicinal. You get that kind of blackcurrant and eucalyptus, sometimes menthol, can taste a little bit like alcoholic lemon sip, but I mean that in the nicest way. It's delicious, but it's just something to pick out. And that eucalyptus tends to be quite a good sign of an Australian Cabernet. So it's a good blind tasting trick, that one. Then to the other side of your screen, we've got what it does when it's oaked. It tends to be quite good when it's sort of got this lovely smoky touch to it. We're getting toast, cedar wood, all of those things again. And you also get a bit of down the bottom, that's kind of a bit of a combination of oak and age. That's cigar box smell again. Tobacco again, very much so. And then really old Cabernet Sauvignon blends tend to have a bit of, I couldn't find a picture of wet forest floor, so you'll have to amuse me here. It's I've put some leaves, but it can have a kind of like leafy vegetal smell. I love old Cabernet when it smells like going for a walk in autumn when it's just rained. There's like earth and wet leaves, and it's certainly not a fresh smell, but it's not a degradation smell, it's not rotting. It's this sort of lovely, the rain's just fallen and it smells like leaves and countryside. So that for me is a very quick whistle around some smells and tastes of Cabernet. If you are tasting along with the blind spot in particular, I get masses of blackcurrant, I get cherries, I get a little bit of blueberry, but it's definitely more black fruits for me than perhaps the Syrah was last week, or even the Merlot. But I'm getting that green flavors, those herbaceous notes. That bell pepper is in there a little bit. Now, this was a particularly cool vintage, 2019 in the Yarra Valley, so that makes sense. The colder the vintage, the more likely you're going to get those herbaceous notes. And I am getting definitely the pencil shavings or pencil. It's not pencil lead anymore, is it? It's not actually lead we're smelling, but you get the drift. So yes, that is the whistle stop tour on flavors. I would like to mention now, whilst we're talking about Cabernet in general, it is good at aging. So those smells and aromas I was talking about, that forest floor, a bit of cigar box, tobacco leaf, those are really appealing when it comes to aging Cabernet. And it tends to produce wines that can really live for a very long time. So whether it's French oak, giving that more woody note, or even American oak, which tends to give it some more sort of sweet baking spices, some maybe of more of that star anise and things like that, vanilla pods. But aging Cabernet is a beautiful thing. So yes, give it some oak, give it some age, and it can do wonders. And what it tends to do is soften those tannins, and it sort of softens how would I describe it? Softens the tannins, and it slightly changes the acidity, slightly changes how the acidity presents itself. So it's a little bit of an easier drink. So we've just had the real name for the smell of rain. I'm probably going to pronounce this poorly. Petrichor. but I have never heard that. So thank you. There we go. I'll add it to my list of lovely smells of Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's specifically rain on leaves that I get, which sounds so specific, but yeah, how lovely smelling Cabernet when you go on a walk. Could be worse. So yes, let's talk about Australia. You might think, why on earth are you not starting in southwest France? We should go to Bordeaux first. But there is method to my madness. This particular lineup, this is the only straight Cabernet. Now, you can blend Cabernet with Shiraz quite a lot in Australia, and I mentioned that last week. This one isn't, and you do get a lot of straight cabs from Australia too. You do also get lots of blends, and it's really hard to talk about Cabernet without talking about blends because it's such a perfect partner to grapes like Merlot, to Cabernet Franc. But when I'd rather talk about it by itself, and then we'll talk about it in blends. So it made more sense to do it this way around. Parts of Australia that you really can look out for. Let me see if I can get my laser going, but anybody who saw me last time may recall that that wasn't, in fact, I'm not going to, I'm just going to use my cursor, safer. But there are certainly parts of Australia that are more favourable or produce specific styles of Cabernet. Oh, my cursor's not playing ball, but there we go. Margaret River, just here on the west coast, very famous Cabernet producing region, but they tend to make Bordeaux blends. They do produce a lot of first class straight Cabernet, but then sort of maritime-ish climate, slightly more, a little warmer than Bordeaux, but they've got a lot of water influence, and Cabernet thrives actually. It doesn't need it needs good draining soils, but you're all right, as I mentioned, with being near the ocean with those, it's quite disease resistant. So you're going to expect a few more Bordeaux blends there. What we're going to be looking at today, because I do appreciate I've got two wines to talk you through briefly, but oh, sorry, my cursor's not being fabulous. But down in the south section, there are lots of parts of Australia that produce Cabernet. So that's a zoomed in version of the south section. Obviously, I've mentioned the Yarra Valley already, but there are other parts that certainly produce very, very top quality. You can hear a lot about Coonawarra, and one of the I'm glad Tim's not on tonight because I will make a mess of a lot of these pronunciations. I always do. But a lot of the wine produced here has this lovely high acidity of Cabernet, and it's very famous for a particular type of soil called Terra Rossa, these red soils, and has some very, very old Cabernet vines as well. So Coonawarra is one to watch out for. Other parts of Australia that you might want to look at, well, there's, to be honest, there's so much here. But the Yarra is cooler than some of the other regions in the south section. So McLaren Vale tends to make a warmer, sort of hotter style. So the fruit might be not cooked, but a little bit more mature, riper fruit. Whereas the wine we're enjoying here in the Yarra Valley, that cooler climate, you may recall, was quite good for Pinot as well. So it's really on the cusp of growing. It's quite cool that it can grow both. But it's definitely on the cooler end. So those wines tend to present of a more Bordeaux style, and actually more of a traditional old school Bordeaux style. They're more green, though they do have those sorts of aromas we were talking about just a moment ago. Plenty of other parts. Like I said, some blended, some single varietals. It's the third most grown grape variety in the whole of Australia after Shiraz and Chardonnay, so hardly surprising. And like I've already mentioned, can have this sort of eucalyptus note that's specifically, less so in the Margaret River, more in this South Australia part, you get the eucalyptus. And there are even sort of particular areas as well, that Coonawarra being one of them. Barossa Valley can as well. The Barossa is a great place for Cabernet. So couldn't recommend Aussie Cabernet enough. So I hope that you're enjoying this one. And I'll be really quick on both actually. So I'll start with the Blind Spot, which is produced for us by Mac Forbes. It's been the region's #1 grape variety since sort of like late 1800s. But it boomed in the 1990s because we all decided we loved Australian Cabernet in the UK, which is great. And this is produced in a more Bordeaux style of Cabernet. So it's more medium bodied rather than full bodied. It's got slightly lower alcohol, I think. In fact, I should have there we go. Yeah, 13.5%. So you wouldn't necessarily go, oh yeah, big juicy Australian cab. It's cooler year, as I mentioned already. And so you do get some of those more sort of perfumed violet aromas and a bit more of the green. I love this style, but if you were expecting a big, fat, juicy, oaked, massive Cabernet, this isn't it. This is definitely a more refined version. So quickly, oh, sorry, I didn't have a picture of the Yalumba, and I'm not drinking it, so I apologize. But we've just started selling this wine, and it's a wine I used to use to teach Cabernet at WSET level 1 and 2, because it's a brilliant expression. Yalumba, the producer, was actually established in the 1800s. They're a very, very old family producer, still owned by the same family, but they are huge. They're very big, and that affords them the massive luxury of being able to produce wines on sort of big scales, but at great quality. And to give you an idea, their wine is called a South Australian wine, which means it will be a blend. And what that can do, which is really great, if you can afford to have pockets of parts of Australia that you can blend from, they'll have real good consistency, that's terrible English, really good consistency year on year, because they can pick different pockets for different climates. And they'll also tend to have some really good complexity, even if the fruit wasn't the best ever fruit. They can actually pick all these different parcels and make sure they have the right acidity. So it's a blend. But it's not a blend of grape varieties, it's a blend from different regions. So if you have got that one, yummy, lucky you. I didn't get it, but I am enjoying my blind spot, and Max Fab winemaker as well. So we love working with him on our blind spot series. Right, I better crack on, so I apologise. I'll just exit this stop share quickly and then quickly chat to you about other New World countries that produce Cabernet, and then we'll go to Bordeaux, because I know everyone's itching to go to Bordeaux. New Zealand, so right near Australia, obviously. Right near, it's not really good geography, but Hawke's Bay tends to be the best place to get your Cabernet. You might not expect it, but China is a huge producer of Cabernet Sauvignon. I believe, and I could be wrong, it's their second most planted grape variety. I'll have to check the stats on that. It's either first or second. South Africa, they often produce varietal Cabernet Sauvignon, so single varietals. They do Bordeaux blends as well, and they're very famous for them, but they often do produce single varietals. They have had problems with disease in the past, though. So unlike other parts of the world that grow Cabernet. South America. Now, South America, the real one I want to tell you about. Argentina is great, but they tend to be silky, big tannins. South America, the real one I want to tell you about is Chile, because if you want good value for money, then Chile is probably the best place in the world, in my opinion, for Cabernet Sauvignon. They have pre-phylloxera vines dating back a long time, because phylloxera hasn't savaged them and ravaged the vineyards like it did in Europe. So you get great value. It tends to be fruit forward, so quite fruity, but in a Bordeaux style. So the winemaking is quite Bordelais, but they're fruitier. And the tannins can be quite austere. And the two regions I'd look at would be Maipo and Colchagua Valley, but actually there's a lot of good Cabernet grown all over Chile. Couldn't talk about Cabernet without talking about the USA. Not just California either. There's some great stuff grown in Washington, which is lovely. It's actually very hot, almost desert-like in the parts of Washington that Cabernet is grown, and it thrives. Any hotter and it probably wouldn't, but it's perfect there. And then USA, California, Napa and Sonoma, it had to be mentioned. They are expensive by and large, but my goodness, they're good. And they tend to be richer, really well oaked. Now, if anybody's never heard of the Judgment of Paris, I would highly recommend. There is a film called Bottle Shock, which is a great film to watch about it, or there's a new documentary coming out about the Judgment of Paris. But in the 1970s, in 76, Stephen Spurrier, who sadly recently passed away, but he was a journalist and merchant and British, and he wanted to see whether you could tell the difference between these Cabernets from California and these Chardonnays from California that were just coming out. So he did a blind tasting with lots of famous people and tested Bordeaux and white Burgundy against these US counterparts. And in terms of Cabernet Sauvignon, it was the US won on both counts, but the top wine for Cabernet Sauvignon was produced by a company called Stag's Leap. And they make absolutely fantastic wines, but they really put Californian Cabernet Sauvignon on the world map. And I don't think there's many people in the world that would argue that after Bordeaux, there is no better place to grow Cabernet than California. So, since we've chatted about Bordeaux and since we're talking about the Judgment of Paris, it makes sense for us to go and take a look at Bordeaux. Now, bear with me just a second. I'm going to get the slides back up. Sorry. So, it's just flicking through. It's a little bit delayed. I apologize. But it's worth saying that Cabernet Sauvignon, sorry about that, Cabernet Sauvignon is not the most planted grape variety in Bordeaux. Merlot is. But, sorry, my map's not coming up. Bear with me a moment, members. Oh, it came up and then I flicked back through. Sorry. So the green section you can see there, Bordeaux, is where, light green, I should say, is where it's very popular. But there are other parts of France as well that grow it, such as the Languedoc, which is that lovely bright blue section. But we are going to focus on Bordeaux. Now, I do apologise. I've got a flashing light, so I may have to turn that off in a second. Bear with me just a moment, members. I will be one tick. Otherwise, I don't want anybody to be ill with a flashing light. So please bear with me. I'm so sorry about that. But yeah, after the dramas of Strictly's flashing light crisis over the weekend, I certainly don't want to make anybody unwell. So sorry about that. So here we are in the Bordeaux wine region. It is the biggest appellation producing region in France. So the wines are graded, should we say, in a triangular system of quality, but you can produce Bordeaux wine from all around. If you're buying a sort of standard Bordeaux AOC, then I would suggest that there won't be as much Cabernet in that wine. And the reason is, for anyone who is in my Merlot session may know this already, but Merlot is easier to grow and it's a bit of a hedge against Cabernet, which can be quite fickle to ripen on this marginal climate. It's just warm enough in Bordeaux. Global warming is helping, but it also doesn't perform too well on certain soils. And those soils tend to be on that right-hand side. They're more clay soils. People say things like Cabernet doesn't like to get its feet wet. But those sorts of soils are not great for Cabernet. However, something rather wonderful happened. And all the Merlot was planted on this right section here, lovely. And Cabernet came pretty late to the party in Bordeaux. But what happened was the Dutch in the 17th century, I believe it's 17th, could be 18th, don't hold me to that. They drained this region here, the Medoc, the peninsula. It was all marshland. And what they did is they literally drained it. They were obviously Dutch, very used to lots of water and getting rid of it. And underneath, they found these little gravel outcrops. And you can almost, and I say almost, but you can almost picture them by looking at that map. The little gravel mounds are the best spots to grow Cabernet. Now, there are two parts to the Medoc, I should say. There's the lower Medoc, the Bar Medoc, and that's this red section. And then there's the Haut Medoc, higher Medoc, and that's this orange section. The crus that you may have heard of and love, Margaux, for example, you've got Margaux being like sort of softer version, Pauillac being very graphite-y, Saint Estèphe, basically the most famous wines in the world, appellation-wise, are in the Haut Medoc, that higher bit. So it's slightly more sheltered, but it's got that really good gravel. The lower Medoc, that red bit doesn't tend to have quite the same gravel. Gravel is good for Cabernet. We like gravel. So one good tip if you are buying sort of mid-price Bordeaux wines, I should say, or not the cru, so not your Saint-Eustache, your Saint-Julian's, you can look for Haut-Medoc on the label, and they will put it because it is its own appellation. So rather than just buying Medoc, which could be from that red section and perhaps not got so much Cabernet, if you are looking for Cabernet heavy wines, then the Haut-Medoc tends to be the better buy. They tend to be, and I say tend, they really do tend to be more Cabernet dominant. One thing that's quite interesting, and I was talking to a winemaker about this yesterday, is what they will also have is they'll have stipulations about how much percent or what percentage of certain grapes they can plant in their vineyard portfolio. And that's how the appellation system in France is quite well regulated. And so Haut-Medoc has a bias towards Cabernet, and that shows in the final blending components of the wine. So there are other parts of Bordeaux that also grow very affordable. So the Bourg here can make some very affordable, this sort of grey area, some great stuff there. Obviously, it's just a hop, skip and a jump over the river from some of those really, really top wines. But the Grave as well down here, this sort of greeny section, that can also produce some pretty good Cabernet. But if you really want the top stuff, it's the Medoc in particular and the Haut-Medoc specifically. That is the home of Cabernet. So I'll just stop sharing that quickly. Oh, that was silly because I was going to show you the wine. The wine that we're tasting, or I'm tasting, and hopefully some of you are as well, is Chateau Peyre-Robon, Haut-Medoc. It's the oldest wine in the evening, being a 2009. It also won Wine Champions this year. So I was going to read you Tim's quote, but I think it's already on here. Yes. Mature, full, rich, and smooth as silk. And he was tasting that blind, so he just wrote that without knowing it was. I'm sure he knew it was one of his wines, our Bordeaux buyer, but you can absolutely get that. I think this is the wine for me that needs the longest time out of the glass. Sorry, I picked up the wrong wine, silly me. It needs the longest time in the glass, out of the bottle, to really allow it to shine. But my goodness, when it does, hopefully you're getting a bit more of that kind of that leafy, vegetal, slightly older smell to it. It's definitely, for me, less obviously blackcurrant than the first one. And remember, because it's a blend, it will also have some of that Merlot, giving it red fruits. And here we've actually got a tiny bit, a smidgen, 3% of Cabernet Franc and 2% of Petit Verdot, but it is 60% Cabernet Sauvignon, and that will be the main thing that you're smelling and you're tasting. In terms of whereabouts in the Haut-Medoc, this particular producer has vines that are classified Haut-Medoc, but also in the Pauillac section. Pauillac does tend to have that sort of pencil shaving, quite dense, quite serious wines, should we say? And I think I'm definitely getting that too. They do produce a Pauillac. It's got a very similar name. A member will know, I'm sure. It's Le Fleur de Peyre-Robon, I think. Yeah, Le Fleur de Peyre-Robon. So slightly different name, but Chateau Peyre-Robon Haut-Medoc is their Haut-Medoc version. So I'm going to have a quick taste. I hope you are too, members. Join in with me. Now, it is the most expensive wine we've done on a sip size. And I thought it was really important to show you really what Cabernet Sauvignon can do when it sings. And like I mentioned, the AOC, those cheaper Bordeaux wines, tend to be more Merlot because they'll be produced sort of from the easier grapes. So Cabernet is expensive in Bordeaux. But for me, that's kind of the perfect archetypal Bordeaux from the left bank. High tannins, it's an old wine, but my mouth is still drying out. That high acidity, my tongue is actually tingling, it's so acidic, but it's got that lovely dark fruit, definitely some pencil shaving things going on in there as well. And it's just starting to turn to that more savory note. Still got lots of fruit, but yeah, it's just turning. So delicious for me. And I think it's worth showing an older wine. If you are a fan of Bordeaux, please do try and pick up a bottle of this, because I don't think it will be hanging around for much longer, especially having won Wine Champs. And yeah, I'm not a big believer in always reading reviews, but I think the Wine Society members have certainly voted with their clicks of their mouse on this one to have 23 reviews and 4.5 stars. So if you don't believe me, believe your fellow members. But I love it. I think it's a fabulous example of Bordeaux. So, sorry, bear with me. I think I just disconnected from my, never mind. So let's move on to other expressions of Bordeaux from around Europe quickly, and then we'll move on to the final wine because it's really interesting. I've already mentioned Languedoc. They have large volume production of Cabernet. The quality tends to vary. There are a few producers making quite expensive but quite delicious blends, but really the vast majority of Cabernet from the Languedoc tends to be on the cheaper end, and it tends to be what I would describe as sort of fruit forward, and then not a huge amount of the complexity that certainly we just had from that wine. Not that fruit forward wines are a problem, but it just doesn't have anything else going for it. In Spain, it's the fourth most planted grape variety, and I believe that it's grown in every single DO, so denomination. And in some, it really does play quite a decent part in the top quality wines. It's really lovely as a blending partner for Tempranillo. Tempranillo tends to be a sort of slightly redder fruited. So for me, it's that lovely red and black fruit combination that Cabernet can bring to the blends of Spanish wines. In Italy, surprise, surprise, we're going to talk about the Super Tuscans again, but one particular Super Tuscan, a wine called Sassicaia, really put Cabernet blended with Sangiovese on the map. And they are fantastic wines. It really does suit blending. But there are also other parts of Italy growing really good Cabernet alone as a standalone wine. Spoke about it before, but Sarah tends not to buy them because they're not traditional examples of the region, and you're not getting typicity because it's a little export, as we all know. But there are too many great Italian grape varieties to fill our boots with anyway. We've also got Israel, really good. And then our last but not least wine, which is the Lebanon. So the Lebanon for me is a really exciting place for Cabernet. And this is again a blend. I would have preferred if we could have had 100% Cabernet from the Lebanon, but the supply chains and needs must, etc. But I really wanted to show one, so I don't mind that it's blended with Syrah. It's actually blended with a couple of other bits, but Syrah mainly. And the reason I don't mind is because I think I'm really glad to support Lebanese wine, especially even this week with even more unrest there. It's lovely to be able to support them, but the wine does the job of supporting itself. The quality of wine from Lebanon is absolutely amazing. So I was hoping that for some of you, it might be a first Lebanese wine. I'm sure for many of you, it certainly will not be. Now, Gil, behind the scenes, my other laptop has finally died a death. So if you are around, if you'd be able to flash up the map of Lebanon, that'd be great. But if not, I'll talk to you about it anyway. You might possibly think Lebanon far too hot to make quality Cabernet. I mentioned that it sort of likes warmth, but not too hot. It might get jammy. Thank you, Gail. However, I must also thank Quentin Sadler, who is a great guy I used to work with, because I've nicked this map with pride. But he produces fantastic wine maps, and finding a map of Lebanon is actually really quite challenging of the wine regions. But the bit you can see down the middle, the Bekaa Valley, Bekaa Valley, that's actually a plateau, and it's the vines of that valley are actually on an average of 1,000 meters above sea level. The Bekaa Valley is generally higher than most of our mountains are in England. So there is great altitude, and that really cools the grapes down. The temperature drops. You have this beautiful sunshine, but you also have this sort of lovely, very cold evenings. So it allows the Cabernet to just chill out overnight and it doesn't get too warm. So you've got all the things that Cabernet loves. Soils are actually not gravel, but they're very happy here. Cabernet's still very happy here. Also, because of the slopes, mostly, I believe almost all Lebanese wine is hand harvested. So that's often a really good way to keep the quality up, because you can be a bit more selective when you're in the vineyard, making sure that only the best comes through. And if you haven't tried a Lebanese wine before, you may still have heard of one. And the most famous wine is Moussa, Chateau Moussa. Beautiful, beautiful wines, and they do love to produce Cabernet as well. Slightly would have really pushed the price boundaries up though. So I'm delighted to be able to show you Casara this evening, because I do think it's fabulous. One quick little fact before I do talk about this final wine, because I found it very interesting. You might say, well, how on earth did Cabernet get to Lebanon? And quality Cabernet? And it's because at the end of World War One, French soldiers were actually sent there as part of the Versailles peace negotiations, I suppose you would call them. And what they found there, these French soldiers, they were producing very delicious sweet wines, but almost by raisioning the grapes. And it wasn't to the French palate. And so the monks of the Bekaa Valley said, we'll get some French grape varieties in. And they planted lots of varieties, particularly ones from the Rhone and Bordeaux. And this is a lovely example of a blend of Bordeaux and Rhone varieties. And it's Chateau Casara, the Reserve du Couvent. Again, you'll see it's got some lovely religious markings on the label, and that is because it was a monasterial wine. It's actually the oldest winery in Lebanon. They can trace winemaking back here to 1850s, so very, very, very old winery. And it was the Jesuit monks producing wine here. During the Lebanese War, they did not miss a single vintage, and you hear that story from a few of the really great chateaux in Lebanon. And I just think it's absolutely amazing. There's such a commitment to producing top quality wine. And it wasn't until the 1990s that they started producing Cabernet and Syrah, but now they sort of hero those two varieties, and that's what makes up their Reserve du Couvent. I should mention it's also got some Cabernet Franc in it as well. Thank you, Gil. But it's definitely a French influenced wine. It's been aged for 6 months in French oak barrels, but in their second year of life. So they're not super, super flavorful. They've been used once. They will still impart some flavor, but it certainly also does a good job of just bringing those tannins polymerizing those tannins, getting that acidity right. It's a gorgeous color. Somebody described it as ruby red. I'm not sure I'd go as red as that, but I do think it's got this lovely, gorgeous color to it. And I find this one a bit sweeter, like sweet spices, more than the others. It's still got that blackcurrant, and that's what makes me think, oh, lovely. And I wonder whether some of that spiciness might be coming from the Syrah rather than the Cabernet, but the blackcurrant's still there for me. And Syrah and Cabernet are partners, or were partners in Bordeaux. They used to blend Syrah into the Cabernet to pump it up. And they certainly still blend Cabernet and Shiraz in Australia. So it's not an uncommon blending, but it is obviously not for everyone, but for some of us, a newer wine region to discover. So I love it. I hope you do too. I did see somebody pop up on the chat that they've the Casara is lovely. I would agree. Yet to have a poor Lebanese wine from the Wine Society, Peter. And I couldn't agree more with those people saying Moussa can be variable. There's a few things going into play there, but Chateau Moussa produces wine in a very rustic style, is what I would say. And because of that, there can be sort of variation that makes it amazing, but variation that can be quite challenging. I get scared using it at wine tastings because each person's glass would be different, and it sounds like you're talking about something completely different. But Chateau Casara, a bit more of modern winemaking techniques, and a very, very consistent wine. So As per usual, we've run up to the 45, but I'll do some quick fire questions now. I'll do 3 or 4, and then hopefully you'll be able to stay a couple of extra minutes if you have asked a question. But if you do need to rush off, thank you again so much for coming. Sorry, Cabernet was never going to be easy as well. I need to pick easier subjects to squeeze into 45 minutes. But yes, so let's have a quick look. You've mentioned South Africa had problems with disease growing Cabernet in the past. A bit of a general question, but beyond grape variety, what are the causes and influences on disease pressure likelihood? Great question. Disease pressure. So one thing that South Africa has in spades is wind, which can be great, but it can actually carry diseases, which is not ideal. You could get rain at the wrong time. That's the real problem. So actually, when it's rained, you want the wind to blow off all the water. I mean, I'm in the Rhone at the moment, and they've had really bad pressures from rots and things this year. That's pretty unheard of. One of the reasons was it was raining, and the wind wasn't blowing away the rain and drying it up. So they had sort of soggy berries that were getting a bit not so nice. So climate is really the big one. Climate's going to just make all of those problems more prevalent. And then there are also things like, if you're organic, you have to have an organic, your vineyard has to be organic for 3 years. So you might not want to put any sort of chemicals in that are going to prevent against disease, but you have to keep that up, and that can be really challenging for people because different diseases come in different years. Weather is never the same. All of those things. So it can be very challenging producing organic wine because nobody can predict diseases and rots and mildews and things. It's very challenging. Does the eucalyptus apply more to Western Australia, where there may be, I think that's what you mean, WA, where there may be more eucalyptus trees, or does it apply to Australian cabs across all cab regions like Coonawarra, etc.? Lots of Australian wine areas are prevalent in eucalyptus trees, and thus lots of Australian cab has a eucalyptus feeling. Yeah, I actually I tend to pick up more menthol in Western Australia, but it does have eucalyptus as well. So that kind of Margaret River band, definitely you can see some, but I don't know why I tend to go more menthol than eucalyptus there, but my gosh, there's a lot of eucalyptus trees. So yeah, all over is the answer. Some regions not so much. So I don't think no, I could be wrong. And for my sins, having not visited Australia, it means that I haven't been able to go do my eucalyptus digging. But yes, it's a real telltale sign across so many wine regions in Australia. Linda, is there a pure Cabernet Sauvignon in France? Yes. So Languedoc, I mentioned, does a lot. Provence does produce a little bit of Cabernet, but they actually do tend to blend it as well. But Languedoc's where you're going to see the most single varietals, and they might even write Cabernet Sauvignon on the label because it's more often than not going to be like a Vin de France. But that doesn't mean it's lesser quality being a Vin de France. It just means that it's not within the appellation regulations. So yeah, you that's where you're more likely to find 100% Cabernet. Linda, is Cabernet Sauvignon best drunk as a blend? I'll finish with that one because that seems a sensible one to finish on. The answer is not necessarily. Bordeaux blends work because they bring a lot of components together that complement each other. So a lot of people find Cabernet, a good Bordeaux can't be drunk young, because Cabernet alone is very or can be, when it's produced in these marginal climates and produced with very concentrated grapes, it can be very austere, particularly in youth. So a lot of people don't find that style of Cabernet appealing. It can be really tannic, very acidic, sort of a real punch in the face wine. And Merlot will soften that, and Cabernet Franc will lift some aromatics. And so the blending partners kind of help Cabernet become more approachable. However, what the USA managed to do, i.e. producing 100% Cabernets or nearly 100% Cabernets and making them in a style that could be drunk much younger and in a far more approachable way, kind of showed the world that Cabernet is brilliant without just being blended. And so whilst there was historically this tradition that Cabernet was a fantastic sort of providing the structure and the backbone to other varieties in Bordeaux, I think, the US as well as Australia, arguably as well, really changed the landscape and said, hey, just oak Cabernet, leave it for a bit, pick it a bit later so that it's a bit juicier and fruitier, and the fruit can balance the tannins and the acids might drop a little. And I have to say, Bordeaux tends to pick later and later now. And, it's maybe arguably borrowed a little bit of advice or a little bit of feeling from the New World and said, you don't have to make Cabernet so seriously that it's undrinkable when it's young. You can make friendlier Cabernets. So really weird answer to your question. Is it best drunk as a blend? Historically, yes, but I think that winemakers around the world have proved that it's a beautiful grape variety by itself. So I would encourage you to drink as much of both styles, blends and single varietal Cabernets, because I can't get enough of them. And then if you are deciding what to have for dinner this evening, there's nothing like a good steak with Cabernet. So I literally can't think of a better combination. So yes, that's it. I will, as always, send a quick email around with all of the quick little bits that we didn't go through, all of the countries and the regions, etc., that I mentioned. But other than that, I hope that you've managed to get at least one nice bottle of wine open this evening. You'll probably find that if you can't drink it all tonight, it's just as delicious tomorrow. Cabernet is certainly one of those varieties that you can drink it tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, and it will taste just as good. So I hope you enjoy. Please spend the rest of the week indulging in Cabernet. Next week, we're doing our first region, which is ironic because I'm leaving the Rhone at the weekend, but we will be virtually visiting the Rhone next week. So please do join. It would be lovely to see you all again. We've got three wines for next week already online, and they're all still available. And likewise, we've got most of our stuff up for the rest of the year. And as of tomorrow, fingers crossed, I think our Sip Size events for December will be going online. So lots going on, and we hope to see you next week. And thanks again to Gil and Mahesh behind the scenes. Thank you all, and cheers.